Good afternoon, everybody. Hope everybody's full. My name is Paul Shadle. I'm a lawyer in DLA Piper's real estate group here in Chicago and a co-chair of this event, along with Barbara, Jay, John, and many others who have contributed to it. I want to thank you again for being here. I'll repeat something that John said, which is that we've seen ebbs and flows with the COVID culprit that sent us all into isolation and away from one another in the first place. And I'm just going to repeat how happy I am to see a large group of people in a room and not nervous. So we should be careful but savor our time together. So that's a good thing. I hope you've enjoyed the day so far. It's also good to see people from outside of Chicago. We have an unusually beautiful day today, so when this is over, go take a walk on the lakefront or up Michigan Avenue. We want people back downtown. We've had a morning full of interesting and substantive discussions. It's pretty clear to me that our industry is resilient despite this ongoing change and disruption, where none of us is really sure exactly how and where we're going to live, work, and play, even in the near or midterm. We heard about inflation. We heard about interest rates. We heard about back to the office or not, volatile politics or at least unpredictable politics. I think we know quite a bit about the things we don't know a lot about, is what we heard this morning. But amidst all that, there's a lot of confidence. And so before turning to a panel that will place all of that in context, I want to draw your attention to this afternoon's sessions that will follow our panel, which will focus on repositioning and innovation, and will also bring a range of perspectives to the current state of deals. So we have a really interesting afternoon that will follow our luncheon. We'll also cap things off after that with a return to our in-person real estate live format with brief presentations that focus on climate change, ESG, and sustainability. But now I want to move to the lunch panel. So in a time that in a somewhat hackneyed but serious way can be described as presenting peril and opportunity, we have a distinguished trio of people who have worked at the highest levels of government, national defense, and business, and you may be well aware of their experience and accomplishments, but just a few highlights on each of them. Our lunch panel will be moderated by Judy Turchin, the former COO of Equinox, who until very recently managed a multi-billion-dollar lifestyle and fitness company with more than 100 locations and 14,000 employees. She is now the founder of JPT Partners, a global advisory firm that's focused on constructing and implementing multifaceted, high-growth plans for private equity and founder-owned consumer businesses. She's also a lawyer, or a recovered lawyer, who, before her tenure at Equinox, served in several roles at Blackstone Real Estate, including general counsel and chief administrative officer, and she started her career at Wachtell Lipton, so as a commercial real estate lawyer. So, Major General Kim Kreider had a distinguished 35-year career in the U.S. Air Force, where she most recently served as Chief Technology and Innovation Officer for the United States Space Force, and where she oversaw the space science and technology portfolio and directed a digital services portfolio to advance the $15 billion global military space enterprise for 16,000 personnel. And prior to that, General Kreider served as the Air Force's Chief Data Officer and led the implementation of the Enterprise Data Management Portfolio. She now serves as a senior counselor at the Cohen Group. General James Mattis served as the 26th Secretary of Defense in 2017 and 2018. Prior to that, he had a 43-year career in the Marine Corps, which culminated with 3 years as the commander of U.S. Central Command, where he oversaw joint efforts in Afghanistan and Iraq and helped shape U.S. policy toward Iran. And during his career in the Marine Corps, General Mattis also served as commander of the U.S. Joint Forces Command and the Supreme Allied Commander Transformation. He is currently in two places, the Davies Family Distinguished Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, where he lectures and writes on domestic and international security policy, and he also serves as senior counselor at the Cohen Group. So please welcome our panelists. And I'll now turn it over to you, Judy. Take it away.
Thank you, Paul. Great to be here. Thank you both for joining me. I'm looking forward to speaking to both of you. I think some people are still eating lunch. I'm used to competing with attention. I live in a house full of men who are eating, and I'm trying to talk. So I'm used to this. So we'll dive right in. Thank you both for joining me. We're going to have a conversation today on leadership, which I know is a topic near and dear to both of you. You've written on it, General Mattis. You've spoken a lot about it. Before we go into leadership, though, I feel like having you both on the stage, everyone in this room would love to hear from you about the war in Ukraine. And maybe we can spend a minute or two on your thoughts around when and how the war ends. I know a lot of folks have been up here speculating. I suspect you two have a strong opinion on this.
Well, I think John had it pretty well yesterday, Judy, when he said things aren't looking any better in the Ukraine. This is an earthquake event. Make no mistake about it. And every one of us, every one of your families, your businesses are going to be impacted by this. And I think that you're going to see such a disruption come out of this that you're going to have to make adaptations in your life, whether you're a poor man living down in South Asia or a lady trying to raise a family in India, or you're right here in the heartland of America. And what you have to recognize is, for this to end, there's got to be some kind of political accommodation. We all realize that. But Putin, a creature straight out of Dostoevsky, is not going to allow much room for that accommodation right now. He sees Russia surrounded by nightmares, and there's only two kinds of countries that he looks at outside his own mother Russia. One is an enemy and one is a vassal. A vassal does what it's told, when it's told. Think Belarus. Any other country he sees as a threat. So what would make him right now that he's made such a strategic folly that Sweden, that hasn't been part of a military alliance since Napoleon's time, that's 200 years ago, Finland, that stayed neutral through the Cold War, even Switzerland is kind of rejudging what neutrality means today as the former two joined NATO. So in the midst of that kind of level of stupidity and the cost to Russia, how does he find his way out? Right now, the diplomats do not have a path forward. So look forward to more ghastly headlines. Take our director of CIA seriously when he talks about the nuclear threat should not be dismissed. And just batten down the hatches. I know many business people want this to end quickly. The Ukrainian people are reminding us in the democracies some things are worth fighting for.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll just echo a lot of that now and reinforce what we heard Ambassador Grossman say last night. You know, this is a human toil that's underway in Ukraine today, and so hopefully that part will end soon. Hopefully the human suffering will come to an end soon. But as General Mattis said, you know, this is not likely to go away as a problem in our world. What Putin has set up is going to, I think, be a protracted condition that we're going to have to live with for some time. And it's going to affect a lot of the way in which the world order and the world economies adapt and adjust. And so I do think we're going to have to take all those things into consideration. I think, too, though, that we've seen a lot of interesting things happening in this crisis that are, some are very positive in the sense I talked about last night, where we've seen commercial satellite companies, for example, demonstrate the power of space and commercial space. And we've seen other effects in Europe. Ambassador Grossman said last night, and General Mattis reinforced here on the stage, how Europe is coming together and reinforcing the alliance. So those positives are an outcome of all of this that I think is going to create a new world order that will have some benefits, hopefully, of innovation, of cooperation, of collaboration, and whatever Putin is up to, whatever Putin is going to do next, he's certainly, I think, facing a global community that is going to be much stronger as a result of it.
Thank you both for that. I think someone who's emerged in the war as sort of a central figure is President Zelensky. It's fair to say it's high stakes. I'd love to hear from each of you as you think about him and a figure. What does it mean to lead successfully during a crisis like this? What are the characteristics? I think each of us probably will encounter some sort of crisis, certainly not of the scale and size that he is, but how do you think about leadership in a crisis, and what advice would you have for any of us if we were to confront that?
Well, I'll start. And then, well, let me just say, I love President Zelensky, don't you? I love this guy.
And his social media is amazing, by the way.
I love this guy. He's an inspiration, and he's a hero for all, certainly for the people of Ukraine, and deservedly so. I need ammunition. I don't need a ride. That's huge. That says it all. That says it all. That is leadership in one sentence. I need ammunition. I don't need a ride. The fight is here. That is what has inspired his people to rise up against incredible odds. And so when you talk about leadership, I mean, leadership in crisis, I think, it's been said that leadership is forged in crisis. That the true nature of a leader will show itself in a crisis. And this is what we're seeing here. I guarantee you, and General Madison, knows better than I do, but I guarantee you, any of us who have been in a position of leadership, when the going gets tough, right, is when you really know, who you are and what you're able to accomplish as a leader. That's where it all gets put to the test. So I think that what we're seeing now is just an incredible example of somebody who probably surprised himself when stuff started to hit the fan, and he looked inside himself and said, I'm going to lead this country. I'm going to lead these people. And we are not going to let our country be overrun. So that's why I love Zelensky.
Yeah, I think what General Kim pointed out earlier about Europe has come together, it's only come together because President Zelensky gave it time to come together. Had this been over right away, then we would have been, like often with the democracies, shooting behind the duck as it was going by. I think that you have to understand that crisis leadership really is different than leadership in the normal give and take of life. Obviously, you CEOs and you leaders of your companies, you're always the sentinel watching for things. But when a crisis comes, you have to understand the fundamental nature of it is that you're not in control and it's unpredictable. That's what makes it a crisis. And so when that strikes, you've got to recognize you're in a fight in every crisis between time and knowledge. And let's just take COVID for a minute instead of the Ukraine, but it applies in any crisis. You've got COVID breaks out, and doctors, nurses, scientists are scrambling. How do we define it? How do we identify it? How is it transmitted? Can we make a vaccine? How do we treat it? All these things are going on, and they fill in all the information gaps with assumptions, because you're not allowed to do your best as leaders. You have to act, and you can't wait until you have perfect knowledge. So as the new knowledge comes in, you're also having to change the advice or the decisions you made, 2 days before, in what normally would have been the annual review that you're now running every week. So by recognizing the nature of a crisis, it allows you to focus in on what changes in terms of your leadership. And from, being in the military, General Kim and I just careened from one crisis to another, frankly. We're still in therapy right now in our 12-step recovery program, years after getting off active duty. But the two qualities that come out that must be balanced are competence and empathy. Because if you're not competent, that crisis is going to be an audit, an assessment that's going to rip the veneer right off where you've been riding on your staff and not doing your homework. At the same time, people need to know they're probably scarred, they're probably scared already. They need to know they're going to get through it. And that's where your empathy saying, I know what's wrong, I know how you're feeling, we're going to get through it. Think Churchill in the dark days of World War II, think Zelensky, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition, that sort of thing. So as you come to grips with something like this, it always struck me that the people who seem to do best with those two qualities are the player coaches, the ones who see their leadership role as being, I can play the game, but I'm going to coach others to play the game. And I found, frankly, as a 21-year-old second lieutenant overseas with 40 sailors and Marines in my infantry platoon, I could command them in about 10 minutes a day. The rest of the day I spent coaching young 18, 19-year-old infantrymen. When I was a 4-star at age 58 with 250,000 U.S. and Allied troops, I could command them in about 10 minutes a day. I was spending the rest of the day coaching them, and now I was coaching admirals and generals from 2 dozen nations. But my point is, it's the ability to be empathetic that allows your competence to be heard. There's a fable about, from the medieval days, about a traveler on the road to London, and he runs into 2 other fellow travelers. One's named Fear and one's named Plague. And he says, why are you guys going to London? And Plague answers, oh, we're going to go up there and we're going to kill 10,000 people. And the traveler looks at him and says, you sure about that? You can do that? And Plague says, oh, no, I can only kill 100. Points at Fear, he'll kill the rest. And just think about what's going on in many of our places today as we look at what's happened in Europe, where, look at Germany. I mean, 70 years, what was called Ostpolitik. And the Ukraine war breaks out the second time Putin's invaded Ukraine. And a 70-year policy is thrown over the side in 72 hours. There's a leader who recognized he had to break with 70 years of tradition of Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, and he had to lead his people with empathy but competence, saying, we got to protect Germany, and we can only do it in consonance with 2 other leaders. And those leaders right now, who are displaying the type of crisis leadership that Judy's asking about, is Jens Stoltenberg, now on his 2nd extension as the leader of NATO, Secretary General of NATO, and probably the most cunning, capable diplomat of our time, Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, who took the CIA's warnings back in December and turned it into the preparation. Remember what General Hooper said last night? Plans are nothing, but planning is everything, and the sanctions were ready to go when Putin moved. So there you see crisis leadership stripped down, and at the same time she's saying we're going to have to find a way to heat the homes, keep the industries going. She's empathetic, besides having the competence to put it together.
Yeah, no, I'd love to, we're talking about current leaders, maybe take a step back. General Mattis, you are the eternal student of history. Rumor has it you have 7,000 books in your personal library. Has leadership and what it means to be a leader changed over time? When you go back to Marcus Aurelius, when you look at George Washington, when you look at most recently Nelson Mandela, how do you think about leadership and the principles of what makes a good leader? How have those changed over time?
I'm not sure it's changed. Okay. George Kennan, writing about the political scene that David Axelrod was talking about this morning, he said that what you have to avoid when you get up high in any organization, he was talking about government, applies anywhere, is to make sure your subordinates avoid the treacherous curtain of deference, where you let the leader drive right off the cliff, like Putin, who's silenced every contrary voice, and he's driven Russia right off a cliff here. So how do you set that organization up, leadership-wise, so you don't end up in those situations? You know, part of your job is the physician's oath to first do no harm. And the way you do it is you build trust. Okay, that's nice. How do you build trust? And I'd suggest you do it by training your subordinates on as many decisions as you can delegate to their level and give them authority over it so they have ownership of what you're doing. And as you lead in that style, you will find that if you give them room for their initiative and aggressiveness, they will find solutions as problems crop up, unless it's a crisis, and that normally goes up to the corporate level, of course. But I think, too, that you got to recognize one thing if you're going to delegate. You'll be more forgiving of your own mistakes at times because you know what went into them. But when subordinates make mistakes, you've got to be willing to forgive those mistakes and look in the mirror and say, what could I have done to create more trust so I could have heard he or she was running into this problem earlier? In other words, look in the mirror for the challenges you face. If it's a lack of trust, they will not bring the problems to you. They don't trust you. And so you've got to work on trust as not a byproduct, but as an actual goal inside any organization. That said, a lack of discipline is something different, and you have to know the difference there. I remind people, even Jesus of Nazareth had 1 out of 12 go to crap on him. So once in a while, you're going to have to drop kick somebody through the goalposts of life. It's one thing for someone trying to do the right thing and they make a mistake. I've made more mistakes than she has, because you see in my gray hair, I've done that. But at the same time, if it's a lack of discipline, a lack of fire discipline on the battlefield, a lack of reporting discipline, they weren't transparent to the corporate level, sexual harassment, drug use, DUI. When I saw those kind of things, I knew I had a unit that was going to be in trouble on the battlefield. And those you cannot allow in a crisis. People are going to feel, hey, the old rules are off. And some people, you got to make sure they know, don't cross you.
Great, thank you. I'd like to pivot us, General Carter, if we could, for a minute. You are a female leader who has sort of grown up through the ranks in what has historically been a male-dominated field. I'd love if you could share with us a little bit, for those of us in the room, what that's been like, and then maybe you can tell us a little bit. I found it interesting. So you served as the Chief Technology Innovation Officer for the U.S. Space Force, which is the only branch of the military that has been built from the start with women in mind. What did that feel like to be part of sort of a historic moment for us, and sort of your role and how you feel it benefited women in the military overall?
Yeah, thank you. So, well, let me kind of take your questions in order a little bit. So, a woman in the defense community. Well, you know, it turns out that there are actually a lot of women leaders in that, you know, the defense establishment, I would say, the Defense Department, the Air Force in particular, I can speak to most directly, and the Space Force, has certainly evolved. As I came up in the ranks, I, like many women in large organizations, found myself to be, you know, one of a few. But as we evolved and grew as organizations, we certainly have seen more and more women in leadership positions, and that's been phenomenal. Today, the Deputy Secretary of Defense is a woman. The Undersecretary of the Air Force is a woman. In my career, a large number of women general officers have been promoted. In the Space Force in particular, and we'll talk about the Space Force's focus on having a very diverse force here in a minute, but a large number of the senior leaders of the Space Force are women. So the trend has been very positive, I would say. Still more work to do, for sure. But I think in my case, and what I have observed in my military experience, and you know, maybe General Mattis has some thoughts on this as well, that by and large, you know, women in leadership positions have a true voice. And women in all levels of the service have a true voice. It's encouraged. Women leaders make it a point to reach out and encourage other women. And male mentors make it a point to encourage men and women leaders. We were just having a conversation at the table here at lunch that it is true that in the military, the job of a leader is to build other leaders. The focus on the mission requires that you have to be able to bring somebody up behind you. You can't ever get so attached to your job that you're never going to be able to let the next person take it over and take it to the next level. So in that case, you're always looking for those great next leaders that will be able to take your position or be able to rise up and move things to the next level within the organization. And whether or not that's men or women, you're looking for the right leader. So I think we've come a long way in the military, and it's been really encouraging to see that happen. In the Space Force in particular, the Space Force, as Judy said, was really designed from the get-go to kind of take a blank slate approach to everything. And I will tell you that it was a really interesting experience to be sitting around the table, myself and a handful of other senior leaders. Literally, we were the only ones there at the table designing the Space Force. I mean, it was like we just caught the bus and we don't know what to do. And we had an opportunity to really take a step back and think to ourselves, well, the good news is that we can do what we can design the service the way we want to. We felt at complete liberty to not necessarily take every aspect of the Air Force and make it part of the Space Force, but really wanting to design this thing with a new set of principles, a new set of processes, a new way of doing things. If we could recast the way that our organization would work, what would it be? And this is what we had in front of us. So when it came to how do we want to organize this and how do we want to ensure a diverse group of people are part of this force, we made active plans and took action to ensure that we were going to recruit from a wide pool, and we were going to actively manage our numbers so that we would be looking for making sure that the individuals that we were bringing into the service were represented a cross-section of society. And that we would work those numbers. We would actively work those recruiting numbers so that it wouldn't get skewed. And we would recruit from all over the country as well to make sure that we were reaching the populations that we wanted to get to. And then, of course, you have the opportunity as you're bringing people in. Of course, you're bringing people. We brought all the people in from the Air Force to make up the majority of the Space Force. But then as you're bringing people in, you're actively wanting to make sure that you're redesigning your promotion process and your process for development so that you're developing people all along the way with the mindset of we want to have diversity rise up through the ranks in a much more deliberate way and not just letting the system sort of take care of itself. So that at the end of the day, you find out that, some people, have weeded themselves out for one reason or another, not because they weren't capable, but because they didn't see an opportunity for themselves. So the active mentoring, again, the active engagement, the outreach, women to women, the new sort of structures that would allow for a more integral force. The Space Force still is very actively talking about and working heavily with Congress on this idea of a combined component where individuals can go in and out of full-time, part-time service, not necessarily having a separate Space Force Reserve. Space Guard is a separate thing, but not a Space Force Reserve, but a Space Force with full-time, part-time positions that would allow people to go in and out. It works out really well in today's new world of hybrid work and different work structures, and it's useful for both men and women. So being very thoughtful and deliberate about how we recruit, how we develop, how we engage, and how we design structures for managing the workforce all the way through the life cycle, and providing opportunities for people to recreate how they're going to work under what sort of conditions has made the Space Force very different. And I think it will certainly ensure the kind of diversity that we need to address the challenges of the environment that we face.
Do you think it's that deliberateness, if you had to give advice to the folks in this audience around how each of us can create a more inclusive leadership team in our organization? For each of you, is there advice that you would give us to do that?
Well, I think deliberateness is a big part of it, for sure. You've got to really think about what you're designing, right? If this is the outcome that you want, you have to take some deliberate action to think through how are you going to get there. Just like developing any good strategy, you've got to think through it. And so it should be with your workforce and with your workforce planning.
Thank you. General Mattis, if we could transition to, you authored a book called Sign Chaos, which I enjoyed personally. And one remark in your book in particular stuck to me, which was, and I'll try and quote it, but you'll correct me if I'm wrong. It says, if your Marines know you care, then you can tell them when they disappoint you. I'd love it if you can explain to us, I think it's such a poignant remark around what it means to be a leader. How has this come about in your career? Who were the mentors that sort of took you under their wing, both mentored you, but gave you the honest truth? And how can each of us think to become those mentors to people in our lives? I'd love if you could share with us some of those stories that you put in your book for this audience.
Yeah, you know, the mentors I had were largely the Vietnam veterans. Those were the ones that raised my generation of Marines and kind of taught us our grim skills. But what I noticed about the mentors was, number one, anyone who was a good mentor was a very good listener. So good, they would also hear what was not said. They could sense when your confidence was not up, that you were not ready for something. And they would work on these things, and they were trying to teach us that a leader's number one responsibility is to define reality to their team. If you let them live in a dream world, then there were some very bad things that were going to happen. So they encouraged us also, there was a reading list, required reading list. All new Marines, privates, and second lieutenants read these 6 books. You make corporal sergeant, here's another 6. You make captain, here's another 6. You get up to general, you're so proud of yourself, here's 22 books with multi-syllable words in them. You know, I mean, it's something. But what they were doing was forcing us to read biographies and histories of how men and women had confronted similar situations in the past and successfully or unsuccessfully dealt with them. And what were you doing by reading those and studying those and having to do book reports? You were learning what right looked like for leadership. And the most boring leader I found, and the one I copied and adapted to myself, but I copied it, was George Washington. How could he have taken a bunch of free men and slaves who were promised freedom if they fought, weld them into a disciplined army when they said, I don't like listening to those guys in Boston, they talk funny, and I'm from South Carolina. And by the way, you know, I'm a Delaware waterman. I don't take orders from a Virginia grandee who thinks he can order me around. And how did he put it together, an army so good that it could defeat the Redcoats, the finest small army in the world, and one that was going to humiliate Napoleon a couple years later? This was not a given thing that we would have this experiment that you and I call America here today. And in every case, from his time as a young colonial officer in the British Army to a general in the Revolutionary Army to president, he would always listen to people with a willingness to be persuaded. Not to say, thank you, I appreciate your input, I'm going to do what I was going to do in the first place. And he would learn from them. He would listen and learn, showing respect. I used to tell my officers at U.S. Central Command that had 70-odd nations that trusted us enough to put their troops under our command. Not all the good ideas come from the nation with the most aircraft carriers, so listen to them. But Washington would take listening and learning and showing respect for others, which immediately bonded him with them, to trying to help them. In battle, he would go to the worst part of the battlefield. In Valley Forge, he would use his own money and raise money to buy troops blankets and all. And then he would lead. He would listen and learn, he would help, and then lead. And if you watch that process, it comes through in any number of leaders. I used it with people I called Your Majesty or Mr. Prime Minister or Mr. President. I used it with Lance Corporals who were 19 years old, and it honestly works. But you've got to have a model in your mind that somehow sees your people not as overhead costs, but as investments. Exactly what General Kim was saying, that we're always trying to raise the next generation of leaders. And then you have to actually give them room to fly. And by that, You give very clear commander's intent because you don't want to wear your people out when you give them jobs. And commander's intent is very simple. Look at it as a piece that Mozart is writing. The first bar is very clear. My aim is, my goal is, 1 or 2 sentences. And very clear, you state it to a Jesuit's level of satisfaction. And then the last bar is full of notes too, very clear, couple of sentences. And it's my end state is, we will be in this position, ready to do this at the end of this operation. And then in between is what's called the method. So you got the purpose and you got the end state. And in the method, you'd only put in 1/3 of the notes that Mozart used. Because as an executive, if you've raised your your leadership team, your business teams, you want to delegate that authority for decision making to them and leave enough room for them to write their own musical score, like a jazz man in New Orleans. And if you don't do that, you're not going to breed the kind of agile, shared ownership kind of organization that allows you to go forward. I mean, I would read Marcus Aurelius almost daily at times to try and guide me as a leader. But more recently, when I look at what you're having to deal with right now, I would be reading Loon Shots right now, a book by Bacchus, Loon Shots, which is guiding much of what's going on, by the way, in Silicon Valley, because you need to have that agility that a leader can transmit down through their ranks, and then he or she can bring forward a force full of innovative ideas. But that's kind of the framing principles I would use to get there.
Thank you. Your last part is a little bit about tactical advice. I'd like to pivot to that. I think everyone in this room could benefit from each of your ways of organizing and thinking about your day, particularly the amount of decisions that came on your desk each hour, day. We heard before Axelrod tell us about President Barack Obama and just sort of the number of decisions. I imagine each of you was confronted daily with a tremendous number of decisions. How do you think about prioritizing those? How do you sort of spend your day thinking about those? And most importantly, how do you avoid decision-making fatigue that comes from that constant need to be deciding what in your cases were life and death decisions? Any ways for us to think about our day and how to sort of navigate that?
Yeah, well, I'll start. And, you know, Joe Mattis, this principle of, you know, the commander's intent in the end state is so translatable, right, into everyday life. And it really does help any leader and any individual who's trying to manage a lot of high priorities have clarity of focus and certainly have a way to communicate that. But the idea of in your everyday life, and I'm finding this for me even today, I will tell you that right off the bat that I have totally failed retirement. You know, I had a lot of things going on before I retired, and I don't think I've slowed down. But, you know, I've got that can't sit still-itis disease. But what helps me in my everyday life, and certainly I've used these techniques throughout my entire career, is this whole idea of what am I trying to accomplish? What is the end state that I and my team are really trying to get to? So what is the purpose? And when we achieve that purpose, what is it going to look like? Because that clarity of the end state we often overlook that. It's, you know, we can talk about our purpose, we can talk about where we're going, but to be able to clearly define what that end state looks like when we get there is another really important piece. And those two aspects become a very useful guide. And then having the ability to flex around contingencies and changing priorities in any given day or in any given sequence to be able to work through what it's going to take to get to that end state are really the keys to making progress. You know, we often talk about, and there's been a lot of folks that have written about this idea of the hedgehog and the fox, right? The hedgehog kind of has one big idea, one thing it wants to do, one place it wants to go, but the fox sees all the contingencies. And a really good leader has to have a little bit of both of that, right? The where you're trying to go, the purpose, the end state that you're trying to get to, the ability to take bold action in that direction, But a little bit of that, the agility that General Mattis talked about, the agility of the fox to be able to maneuver and focus on what's important now and address the contingencies that are constantly coming at you. So I find that those things were helpful then, they're helpful now, and I'm sure they can be extremely helpful in the large portfolios that you all manage.
Yeah, I won't repeat it because I agree with everything Kim said. I would point out that as CEOs, corporate officers, you're sentinels for your organization, and the more you can anticipate things, the more you'll be able to, in an orderly way, deal with all the information coming in. I'd break the information coming into me into three categories. One was housekeeping. In combat, how many precision-guided munitions do we have left? How many, days of fuel do we still have so we can keep going? How do you push off the culminating point? Then there'd be decision-making information. You know the decisions are coming. You know about when you're probably going to have to make them. So are you aligning the information so you can move smartly at that point? And then there were alarms. In naval service, it's night orders. It's wake the commander immediately. And by doing that, you're not inundated, but requiring it to be data displayed the same for everybody, so everybody's operating off the same data. And by the way, if data is not displayed, it's not going to be acted upon. So, don't go around crying about intelligence failure or something when you saw the intel, but you didn't get it promulgated, and your folks got caught flat-footed. In other words, you got to really organize your information flow, but also organize your team. Make sure you've got some of your folks who are not going to get sucked into the crisis du jour, who are looking, how do you get out of the crisis, or just looking 2 weeks or 2 months or 2 years down the road. And then you've got people handling it, but you've got also handling the crisis du jour, but you also have people who are going to give you a path out, and you'll beat the competition, whether it's in the marketplace or on the battlefield, that sort of thing. I think, too, I would just say that you've got to make sure that you quantify risk. I would never allow people to come in and say, that's high risk, that's low risk. I want to know what specific element takes what specific risk for what specific period of time. Because you can get all caught up in a crisis and then realize there's no crisis. You've got plenty of time to deal with that. Just start breathing through your nose, take a knee, calm down, get some warm milk and burnt toast, and calm down. We'll handle that one. Just take care of yourself here. Don't drop dead on me here. So at times, what you're trying to do, though, is give, the reason we keep some old generals around is it's not our first war or second war. And the kind of way that you're going to feel the ground going up from underneath you. You're going to feel like you got punched in the gut. Things are going to go wrong. You're going to lose people. And you know how your body's going to react. So you can somehow transmit that and coach your young people so they can take it in stride, because it's a pretty grim environment, obviously, when you're betting the farm. No gambling with the force by subordinates. If it's a gamble, that comes up to the top level. You can take risk, let us know what you're doing, we'll mitigate the risk. But if it's going to be a gamble, unless it's life or death at that moment on the battlefield, that comes up to the top level. And that kind of clarity reduces what you're dealing with, and you're getting the big things to you. Let the young folks prove it, that they're just as good as you were when you were young, and give them their head. They'll do it.
It's great advice. I think we have time for one more question, and then we're going to open it up to the room to ask you. Our national security docket, it is quite full. China, Ukraine, just to name a few. Could you share with us what you feel the role of U.S. leaders, business leaders, is in this geopolitical climate? What should we be doing? What can we be doing? How do you think about us navigating sort of what's happening in the world geopolitically?
Sure. What you need to do is set a role for yourself. For example, when I went into Secretary of Defense, a job I never aspired to, never wanted, frankly. I knew I'd been the executive secretary to several, including Secretary Cohen, and I knew it was just a terribly difficult job. But I went in there, you're responsible for the military things. Make sure you give yourself a personal description of what you're responsible for. Don't just take what you've been assigned. Take it to the next level of ownership. Mine was very simple. When I'd get the orders book in once or twice a week, Every ship that sails, every Air Force squadron or Army brigade that deploys is done with a civilian Secretary of Defense signature, civilian control of the military. So the first orders book comes in, and now I'm no longer a general. Now I'm a guy making the decision about it, I'm not requesting it. So I hand wrote a card that said, will this deployment of these troops contribute sufficiently to the well-being of the American people and our allies to justify their deaths? Not to send them in harm's way, not to perhaps get them injured. Could I look their parents in the eye and say they died for a reason, a good enough reason? So assign yourself what your job is one thing. Second point would be, when you look at this world we're in today, look for the existential threats. I came into the office, and believe it or not, we'd had no national defense strategy update in 10 years. It's not a political statement. There were two different parties, two different presidents during that period. But if you ever walked into something, you just feel like you got socked in the gut. You know, we have troops engaged in war. Think of all that has changed in the last now 14 years, and think of not having an updated defense strategy. So I went home that night, threw my bags in the corner of the house I'd rented. I was sworn in the night before, and I started writing on a strategy. And laying that out, you have to look at what is going to force a change on this experiment we call America. And clearly, in terms of urgency at that point in time, it was North Korea with what they had going on. In terms of raw power, it was Russia, because they had a very cavalier way of talking about nuclear weapons at that point, and it's gotten only worse since. And in terms of political will and capability, economic capability, it's China. And every one of those nations had to be listed. And meanwhile, terrorism is an ambient threat. It's not going away. So you had to organize the department along those lines. And first of all, I had to go to every member of Congress, Republican or Democrat, to get their input. I went to every ally that was interested. It took me over a year. But when it came out, that doctrine, that strategy, by the way, is still being used today by this administration, an administration proud to say we don't do what Trump did. But that has carried through and actually got me in my 2 record-breaking years of budgets from the Congress, 87% of the Republicans and Democrats to vote for it. The defense of this country is not a red or blue issue. It is a U.S. issue, and we have to look at writing strategies that unify people when you're put into a leadership role like that. So that's how I organized my thoughts. Cam, over to you.
If it's okay with you both, I'd love to open it up to the audience. We have about 10 minutes left, if that's okay.
Okay.
Questions from the audience?
This is going to get weird if we're looking at each other and no one's saying anything. So
Right.
better ask us something.
I told them that wouldn't happen, so make me proud here, people. Yes, please, Paul, thank you.
General Mattis, I've heard you speak very briefly about the preparedness of young people who go into the various branches of service. And I'm wondering, General Mattis, I've heard you comment very briefly in a conversation about the preparedness of young people who go into military service, different branches. And I'm wondering what both of you think, or all three of you think, about since you take people in both out of high school and out of higher education, what our education system should be doing to prepare leaders for the kind of leadership that you've both undertaken?
Well, I'll jump in and say a few words. Remember what General Kim just said about trying to recruit from all across the country. Right now, we are inhibited by that. The standard, the base level for anyone joining any of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Space Force, Coast Guard, Marine Corps is private in the U.S. Army. It's under Army regulations. It says this is what your height, weight is, approximately. You can't be outside these parameters. This is what your intelligence level, this is your education level, this sort of thing. Right now, ladies and gentlemen, 72% of the male cohort, 18 to 25, just to give you the one cohort that we have good data on, 72% cannot qualify to be a private in the U.S. Army. Obesity, drug use, drinking, flunked out of school, you name it, 72%. Then we have to compete for that other quarter of the population, with universities, for example, as far as people going into the enlisted force often go in as very young people. It's a challenge right now. It's a big challenge. So what we could really use is one great big effort on reducing youthful obesity and a recommitment to education across the country. But one other thing that's taken me from the Native American National Powwow to try and find out how our Indian nations are dealing with this problem of people just failing in what we would call life skills. And I've been to the Mormons to find out how they get their young people. I'm not Mormon, but how do they get their young men and women, increasingly the women too, to go off on mission for 2 years, the same age group we're looking at. And we don't have a good idea for how we're going to remind everyone that this country's like a bank. If you want freedom to take out of it and live by, you're going to have to put something into the bank. And right now, we're not raising people with a sense of commitment. And I would just say to you business leaders, one of the last bastions of accountable leadership, and I mean that right now. The military's won, business has won. It's not in religion right now. It's not in our national policy. Once you've got your second house in the Hamptons or the house in Vail, and the kids' university education paid for, we need you to go into school boards, city councils, run for government, because right now we do not have this understanding of our World War II veterans that a country doesn't have to be perfect to be worth fighting for. We need everyone to pitch in here and raise young people with that sense of commitment. Kim?
Yes, sir. I would just add to that just a couple quick thoughts that, I've seen so many kids coming out of high school and college into the military who, today's generation are pretty sharp, right? And they're coming in with a more of an open view of society, which I think is great. We talked about this a little bit last night. They're coming in very accepting. They're coming in with a lot of great ideas. And so that's a real positive. I would encourage our educators today to continue to promote that and really continue to promote helping young people just learn how to think. Joe Mattis, you mentioned it earlier today when we were talking out in the hall, the whole importance of being able to define the problem before you rush to the solution. And helping young people who tend to come in very competitively and think that they always have to be perfect and have to get it right, that it's okay to experiment. And in fact, that's what we want you to do. And we want you to fail. And we want you to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And we want you to be okay with not being the smartest person in the room. Because if you're the smartest person in the room, you're probably in the wrong room. And that's the kind of mindset that we want to encourage. And we see some of that, but I don't think we see it very broad-based across our society. So those would be the things that I would offer.
Thank you. Other questions?
There's a question back here.
We'll get you a mic. No, we'll get you a mic. It'll be hard for...
Thank you both. Thank all of you, by the way. This has been very illuminating. You talk about existential threats, and everybody, kind of recognized North Korea, Russia, and China, but the world things have changed. I mean, with COVID and Russia influencing our global supply chain, talking about cyber, talking about Iran, with empowering Iran again. It seems like the world can't stop Iran. I'd love to hear a little bit about, and then the things that intersect us in business, which are climate change, and also I would say cyber terrorism, which is probably a big, everybody in the room is probably very impacted by cybersecurity at this point. I'd love to hear your opinions about those secondary existential threats out there and how we should deal with them, or how, frankly, our government's dealing with them.
Yeah.
Well, I'll start on the cyber security piece. I'm really glad to hear you say that. That cybersecurity is certainly a a threat, and it impacts every business and every organization around the world. And it wouldn't be 5 years ago that we had most organizations weren't saying that at all. And so it's really important that we recognize the threat and that we take very strong collective action and take executive level action to deal with it and put the systems in place, have the right talent in place, have the right processes in place for information sharing, because no organization is an island, and we all depend upon each other. So the more that we can identify these kinds of threats and the kinds of vulnerabilities that are susceptible, the more we can prepare to defeat them. And so that's really important. And cyber threats, defensive cyber is never going to go away. It's something that we're always going to have to be dealing with. I mean, you're all being hacked as we speak. You're getting those random text messages on your phone all day long. And don't click on them, by the way. But it's out there, and it's real. And so we've got to deal with that. Climate change is another one. I think that, certainly we've seen more and more impacts of climate on all number of industry sectors, to include space, by the way. And so these kinds of major global issues are certainly ones that we're going to have to continue to coordinate action around. And they're going to affect all of us. Even those that are our adversaries today are going to be affected by these one way or another. So yes, I don't know that I would say that these are necessarily existential at the moment. I think that we can certainly manage our way through them, but we've got to take deliberate action, as we talked about earlier, in order to be able to address, recognize that we have these issues and address them with some real clarity of focus.
Yeah, let me just broaden it slightly here. We have more and more global challenges right now, some of which you brought up, plus we've got the war in Ukraine, it goes on. But we are living in an age when more and more populist political leaders are trying to narrow countries' interests to national level only. And you can't solve global problems that way. So we are going to inherit worsening problems if we don't get leadership back, like the greatest generation coming home from World War II, looked around and said, pretty crummy world, we're part of it, whether we like it or not. And they put the UN together, they put NATO together, they used the Marshall Plan, Bretton Woods 1 and 2. You and I know it as the IMF and the World Bank. So people who'd lost hope actually had a lender of last resort. They didn't have to turn to some fascist to make the trains run on time. That was the greatest generation to learn the hard way what happens when you go internal and say, we're going to wall off the rest of the world. You cannot do that. But here's the age that we live in. It's been pretty rudely brought to bear here in the last about 90 days. You and I have lived for decades now in a world of geoeconomics. And we were sure that if we could work with China and bring them into the global community, that they would liberalize economically, and that would inevitably, remember that adverb, inevitably lead to political freedom and a responsible nation on the global stage. That has been proven wrong with what China has been doing now since Xi solidified himself in power. And obviously Putin, with his invasions of Georgia, Ukraine, and Ukraine 2 that we're living through now, has shown that geopolitics is going to shoulder aside geoeconomics. And we're all going to have to adapt to those realities, even as we try to solve problems that need us all to work together, so they don't become a crisis. They're not a crisis yet, but we'd better take out a life insurance policy pretty soon and start doing something about them, because if we don't, we could hit the point of no return. So that's the world you're entering into, and that is a different world than you've been operating on. If you didn't have a plan to go to zero in Russia 6 months ago, it was too late 2 months ago when McDonald's had to shut down. If you don't have a plan to go to zero in China right now, you're not carrying out your sentinel role. Now, hopefully it won't come to that, but the problem is that hope is not a plan.
Well, you know, and as you were talking, Joe Mattis, I just want to offer too, here again, you know, we've talked about in many cases the benefits of COVID. COVID taught us so much. COVID taught us how to go to zero, right? COVID taught us what it means to have to shut everything down and reinvent how we're going to operate and reinvent how we're going to survive. And as challenging as that period has been for all of us, if we take those lessons to heart and we recognize that no matter what hits us, whether it be a massive pandemic or, you know, a major cybersecurity breach or, you know, some sort of a global climate event, we can survive. We are resilient. We can survive. We have to do the planning, and we can't get lazy about recognizing that we've got to have done the planning so that we're ready to go. But COVID gave us that opportunity to recognize that, wow, we've got to rethink this. And now we can build those plans and have that planning conversation so that when the need occurs, we're able to continue to move.
It's great. I'd like to end on that high note because it was a good way to conclude. Thank you both for joining me. It was such an honor and pleasure.
Nice one. It's an honor, Tim.